Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Sam Woolley, who is an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and an assistant professor by courtesy in the School of Information, both at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the project director for propaganda research at the Center for Media Engagement, also at the University of Texas. Sam Woolley, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Sam, will cover your research, which centers on media, computational propaganda, and ethics. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment of the various information and cognitive related challenges which face global societies today?
Sure thing. I think we live at an interesting confluence of problems and issues in the information space right now. Never before have we seen the amount of data that we see being leveraged for information operations, influence operations, propaganda, but also simultaneously automation and the capacity for anonymity continue to allow all kinds of actor groups, from governments to military organizations to, frankly, all sorts of regular people, to leverage the internet and leverage particular aspects of the internet in order to scale and hide their information attacks. And what I talk about when I talk about this is sort of this concept of computational propaganda, the idea that the propaganda that we see today in the world is not the same as our grandfather's propaganda. It's certainly propaganda has been around forever, but propaganda today is on steroids when compared to the past propaganda we've seen.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I didn't really do your CV justice. Do you think you could give our audience just a little bit more background about your career and research?
Sure, of course. So I did my PhD at the University of Washington, where I worked with a guy by the name of Dr. Philip Howard. Phil and I, back in around 2013, co-founded a project we called the Computational Propaganda Project with a couple computer scientists there at UW. And the goal was to study originally the use of bots on social media in attempts to amplify or suppress particular conversations. And so we had support back then from the National Research Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and eventually the European Research Council. We did a bunch of different research on various countries that were leveraging governments, militaries that were leveraging these kinds of tools in attempts to manipulate public opinion. And eventually what ended up happening was Phil got hired at Oxford University. And so I went out there with him and also got a job out there as research director of a new larger project that was very much focused on the European context, Russian information operations in Ukraine.
This is what time frame, Sam?
This is back in around 2016.
Okay.
So
great.
right around the time of Brexit and the US election. Simultaneous to that, I was a research fellow at Google Jigsaw. So I was kind of in the thick of studying this stuff from a tech perspective. So I was splitting time between Oxford, Seattle, and New York, studying this space. And then, as everyone probably knows, the hinges blew off, and the door was wide open, and everyone kind of knew suddenly that, wow, there's a major issue with our information ecosystem. Not only is it gameable, but there's already a lot of powerful actors in the space that are manipulating folks using Facebook, Twitter, all of the platforms that people know and love or hate. And so from there, where I was at Oxford for several years, we put out a book called Computational Propaganda, and then I decided to go do my own thing. I went to Palo Alto and was a visiting researcher at Berkeley and at Stanford, and studying this stuff. My day job was at the Institute for the Future, which is a spinoff from Rand Corp that studies, futures thinking. I started this lab there called the Digital Intelligence Lab, and really the goal was to engage with social media companies and tech firms in order to help them think about the problems we're discussing today. One of the big things we did while I was there was I helped to co-create with Jane McGonigal and some other folks the ethical operating system, which is a series of guidelines for folks that build tech to help them think through several risk areas and ask questions as they build rather than after they've launched, which seems obvious, but at the time it wasn't so much. And then now I'm very happily at University of Texas at Austin. I have the propaganda research lab here at Center for Media Engagement, and continue to focus on, when I tell people, I guess I tell people that, I focus on emerging media spaces, technology spaces, and propaganda. And I like the term propaganda just because it kind of encapsulates all the stuff that we're talking about, not just disinformation, not just influence ops, but all this stuff.
Okay, one, I find it interesting that you mentioned that Futures Institute. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. But just recently, we had another guest on the podcast, a fellow from the Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Jake Sotiriadis.
Okay,
that's a mouthful. But he founded the Futures Institute for the U.S. Air Force and is now working in the intelligence community on futures-related studies. And we'll have a link to that discussion in the show notes as well. But so you've mentioned propaganda a couple of different times. I think it might be helpful just to do a level set. Could you quickly define terms such as propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation?
Sure. So propaganda is, for me, the umbrella term that captures these other kinds of manipulation that I tend to mention. Propaganda is an attempt to influence public opinion, usually using using appeals to something other than logic. So appeals to emotion, especially. Propaganda tends to be particularly political in nature. That doesn't mean that commercial entities don't engage in propaganda, far from it, but it tends to have political motivations. So it's concerned with power and power dynamics. Misinformation is the accidental spread of false content. So everyone spreads misinformation from time to time. I do it. You've probably done it. Everyone does it. Disinformation is different. Disinformation is all about intent. It is the purposeful spread of false content. So people that spread disinformation are intending to manipulate folks via the use of fake, false information. Then there's all kinds of other terms that fall into this that we don't have to go into. If I've mentioned some of them, I'll talk about them. But the other thing that I talk about a lot is bots and sock puppets. And bots are, as most people listening to this probably know, but they're automated software programs that are doing tasks online that a person would otherwise have to do. So they automate and scale up our ability to do tasks online. They're benign. They're not either good or bad, despite some of the reporting out there. They can be used for both good and bad things, depending on your perspective. And then sock puppets are profiles built to look like real people, but that are, and that have a particular name or something, but that are being run by someone else. So they're an anonymous shell for someone on social media.
So comparing propaganda and disinformation. So you said disinformation is the deliberate spreading of things that the spreader knows to be untrue. Is there an overlap at all with propaganda and disinformation, or does propaganda tend to be distributing something which is at least partially true, but heavily ignoring things that are also part of the story?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I think disinformation is a form of propaganda, but not all propaganda is disinformation, because disinformation is necessarily false content. You can expand that definition if you, which folks like Dr. Kate Starbird at University of Washington have done. If you look specifically at the Russian active measures model, like it didn't always necessarily fall into false content there. It had a little bit of a broader definition. But propaganda tends to always contain at least a kernel of truth. So does disinformation in some cases, but propaganda can be framed in a particular way so as to make it misleading. Herman and Chomsky's classic book, Manufacturing Consent, was all about this propaganda model. The idea was that it was to do with the ways in which the media companies presented certain kinds of information and the powerful entities that were backing those media entities that molded the information that was spread. And for me, propaganda is a sociological phenomenon. Like there's a guy named Jacques Ellul he wrote a book called Propaganda back in the day, and his whole argument was like, propaganda surrounds us. It's an ambient thing. It's not just the messages, but it's also the culture in which we live and the people and all kinds of other things. And it comes together and is quite contextually important. So attempting sometimes to segment it can be very, very difficult. Segmenting it into particular messages can be a challenge.
Maybe we can kind of hopscotch over into an adjacent subject here. So we've had a variety of researchers on the podcast, but relatively few who have some sort of a specialty in journalism. And that is an important component of the information environment and the information professionals community. But I think it would be helpful for our audience to understand your perspective on the role of journalism in society, or it maybe if you could give like a quick little crash course on maybe like a historical perspective on journalism and how it is manifesting today related to this entire problem space. That's that's like a PhD
Small
level question there.
Of course, no, I'm happy to speak about this. So I think it's important to say that propaganda is kind of like the uncomfortable step sibling of journalism, or cousin of journalism. That a lot of journalism becomes propaganda or is propaganda depending on how it's formed. Journalism at its best is a tool for informing society. We call it the fourth estate. This idea that journalism is one of the checks and balances in our government here in the United States, but also in many other governments abroad, that keeps those in positions of power honest. It acts as a watchdog. It shines a light on some of the most severe problems, including things like crime and corruption, but also upon imbalances in society. And there are lots and lots of good journalists, great journalists out there, and great journalistic entities out there. There's also a lot of pretty dubious journalistic entities out there. And so as an institution, journalism more recently has suffered in the public's eyes, particularly in the United States, suffered from a decline in trust because of what people perceive as a lack of objectivity and a growing amount of politics being injected into journalism. And I think that's right in many ways, but it's not new. So you asked me about history. So if we go back to the late 1800s, Herman and Chomsky actually outline this pretty great in Manufacturing Consent in the first chapter, but the advertising model of journalism kind of won out against the trade labor model for journalism, the people's press. And it was because advertisers were able to build scale. They had more money. The bottom line is they had more money than these trade union presses that were rising in the United Kingdom. And so advertisers had a big role in deciding, in sort of soft power, deciding what appeared in news entities' publications. And that's continued through to today. The Hearsts of the world back in the late 1800s and the Pulitzers were running a lot of yellow journalism publications.
Yeah, what is yellow journalism? What does that mean?
Yeah, so yellow journalism is a really, arguably an early form of organized newspaper-oriented or oriented journalism that was highly sensational, fake sometimes, borderline false a lot of the time, but oriented towards getting people to look at the page and stay on the page and buy a particular newspaper. It's probably sounding really familiar to people. The idea was to keep eyeballs focused and to keep people engaged. So very similar to today's social media, but not quite the same level, and certainly not the many-to-many creation system that we have. It was a one entity to many people kind of form of production.
Would the tabloids be considered yellow journalism?
Great example of yellow journalism, especially some of the more sensational tabloids. And so we saw that continue, that kind of model continue through into the 20th century. And of course, we experienced 2 world wars. And during those world wars, there was the development of the real development of sophisticated propaganda by people like Edmund Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who has actually believed himself to be working for the benefit of democracy, saying that in order for our democracy to succeed, we have to have propaganda that is pro-democracy. And so some people to this day still believe those notions. Fast forward several years to the rise of the internet, of course, we had radio and television rise, and they were subsumed in many ways by propaganda systems, but the rise of the internet really marked a big change. And it was because it was the rise of a system where almost anyone could create content. So it wasn't just the Barbara Walters or Dan Rathers of the world that were creating content. It was suddenly or giving people the content. It was suddenly everyone. There's that famous quote, anyone could be a journalist online. You might want to put that in, air quotes, right? Or but anyone can also be a propagandist online is one of the big things that I believe. I think that in some ways the ability to propagandize and to spread disinformation has been democratized in today's area. And I say that with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of ha-ha kind of way, but anyone can be a propagandist, and there is this element of if you have a bit of know-how, you can try to manipulate the system for your own means and ends.
Sidebar here, there's a previous episode that just came out with another researcher from Stanford. He's an economist. His name is Matt Jackson, but he has looked at how online ecosystems are a bit like the children's game of telephone, in that someone can get a piece of information and misinterpret it or deliberately morph it, and whatever the original intent of it was, it has a way of changing throughout the ecosystem as it gets shared.
I think that's spot on. Honestly, I think that's a great observation. And I would say that add to that the scale and speed at which that game of telephone is played makes it particularly dangerous today, right? Because information, there's the old Mark Twain quote about, while someone's, blah, 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 tying their shoes or whatever, lies travel halfway around the world. Well, now it's a click, it's a millisecond, it's unthinkably fast. And so I think that idea about the game of telephone is important, particularly when considered through the lens of, wow, we have a very, very fast, scaled to many people system up now.
Yeah, and my brain was working faster than my mouth was working just a moment ago. But you're talking about how anybody today potentially is a publishing outlet. We all have our devices where we can insert novel information into the environment in a way that was just not possible even 10 years ago, much less 500 years ago. So something can start out as a true, legitimate piece of information, which was put into the environment with no bad intent whatsoever. But anyone can grab that little bit of information, whether it's a meme or whether it's a legitimate news story, and deliberately turn it into propaganda or warp it in a way, and then it's like wildfire. So the example that this gentleman Matt Jackson used was, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but for the purposes of this is basically the gist. There was some kind of a legitimate news story in London. It's like there is a movie shooting, at the intersection of A and B Street, right? So there's like a TV or movie being shot, but someone took that and like turned it into like an actual shooting, like a pistol or rifle shooting, and then you were off to the races, right? So it's just taking something and just warping it in a clever way. And that kind of game of telephone, or the telephonification of converting something into propaganda, is just spreads like wildfire potentially, and that's happening all over the place. It's a wicked problem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's context. Context matters a lot. And also, there's a lot of people and groups online that are attempting to manipulate information for their own means and ends. And so, it underscores the importance of verification systems and of trust online. But it also underscores a lot of questions about free speech versus privacy and safety. And there's a lot of competing interests here when it comes to the problem of that false, potentially really problematic information circulating, that we have to ask ourselves, and we oftentimes get into quite a dicey situation when it comes to thinking about particular kinds of regulation or policy. And also it gets dicey when we think about, well, how do we code for this? How do we as an engineer, how would someone make a system that was a little less susceptible to this kind of manipulation? And it's a question mark, because here in the United States, we really value free speech. We value people's ability to create their own content, to think openly. But one of the things that I've said before in some of my other writing is that conspiracy theory it's like getting off an exit too soon on the road to critical thinking. It feels a lot like critical thinking. You feel like you're doing research, you feel like you're getting into the weeds, but it exists absent some really important stuff like evidence, chiefly, but also empirical, empiricism. So the ability to observe something having happened versus just spreading something because it fits your narrative.
Right. Well, you started going in this direction, but I just would like to ask you explicitly. I know that ethics is a big part of your research, and so what kinds of things do you think are needed along those lines in order to help manage this challenge productively?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that ethics can be split into a number of different formats and be concerned with another number of different institutional concerns. So on the one hand, journalism ethics is something I think a lot about because I teach it here at UT. I think that it's crucial in today's era for journalistic entities to have very clear and open ethics codes. You'll find that folks like the Associated Press and others have more open, clear codes of ethics than many other journalistic entities. But in order for them to contend with the disinformation environment that exists and the propaganda that exists out there and all of the kinds of pressures that exist on journalists, these entities have to think very carefully about how they organize themselves in terms of ethics. The same is true for technologists and for technology firms. Ethics can be kind of a broad term. And so one of the things that I've talked about in the past is this idea that maybe what we need to think about is how we code with human rights and with democracy in mind. Maybe not capital D democracy, but small d democracy. So, the tenets of democracy. How do we build systems that both protect our citizens, but allow them the ability to speak freely? It's a very tricky challenge, but I know engineers love challenges. And so when we think about ethics in software design and even hardware design, we have to think about the ways in which we inject values in at the site of building, rather than constantly asking these questions post hoc once the cat's out of the bag. I think the biggest problem with platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the like is that they didn't really foresee the ways in which their platforms would be misused. And if you talk to a media historian, the media historian would have told them, hey, listen, every single media type of media that's been launched since the beginning of humanity, you go back to the printing press, go back to the newspaper, the TV, has been co-opted by people that are trying to control other folks. And so social media is not going to be any different. So ethics is a really important thing to discuss. I would put a finer point on it and say that we also have to discuss things like human rights. We have to discuss democracy, and we have to make choices. We can't pretend to be neutral in this situation, because the people who are spreading the most sophisticated forms of disinformation propaganda are very far from neutral. And so while we figure out our ethics, these folks are authoritarian governments, countries that are very much oriented towards controlling, making us feel apathetic, making us feel like we don't want to make a decision. And so it's time for some decisions to be made.
Right. Well, I'm thinking out loud here, but as you were talking, for the first time, I started making a connection between the big, broad topic of ethics and security. And in the tech world, it seems to me that security is the last on the list of things to take care of, right? Technologists are interested in getting their great idea operationalized. Let's just get it out there. Let's get it working, and security can come along whenever it becomes a big enough problem to retrofit security. And ethics is kind of like that as well. It's like it is a lagging capability that gets that we're trying to retrofit ethics into this tech stack, or into the journalism stack, and it's hard. But all of the technology that we enjoy, you can't talk about any technology today that's Western technology and not have like a whole bunch of live discussion about cybersecurity and how do you protect the back end and all that kind of stuff. And ethics is kind of the same way. Do you think that there might be something to that?
I think there is something to that. And I think there's a reason why you have people like Alex Stamos, the former chief security officer at Facebook. And then also you have the Twitter whistleblower who worked in security coming forward and saying, this is a total mess. This, like, what we've been doing does not work. Security and ethics, those things have to come first, not last. And so when I was in Palo Alto, one of the things that we did was talk to some of the incubators, including Y Combinator, some of the researchers there, and talk to them about what would it look like to prioritize things like security, trust, and ethics as these startups build, rather than racing to launch without asking crucial questions. You're never going to be able to ask every question. You're never going to be able to preempt every security problem that's going to exist, but you can preempt a heck of a lot of them if you just plan a little bit better. The problem is, a lot of the times it might affect the bottom line. It might make a lot of these startups not very viable. And so another thing that we tried to do was talk to the VCs who were involved in a lot of this and say, hey, listen, it's not going to be a very good thing for you if you get out to market and this product ends up being a total disaster security-wise or ethics-wise.
Yeah, I can imagine how some of those conversations must go. But
they're hard sometimes.
It's something that definitely needs to be grappled with. But I'm also I mean, I agree that it seems like those types of conversations need to come to the forefront. I'm a bit skeptical that human nature is going to be the trump card, and that overcoming our tendency to to ready, fire, aim with technology will still carry the day.
I think that you're right, and I think that there is a lot of people out there who understand that they can manipulate public opinion using the tools that exist, and if they have good resources, they're going to be able to do it well. But right now, the way that we train software engineers, the way we train computer scientists in a lot of instances, it leaves out key questions about ethics, and even security and privacy. I know that at Stanford, when I was out there, one of the things they did was take on the ethical operating system for their intro to computer science class and actually work with some of these software engineers as they were being trained about like how these things might be built in. So I found that really heartening. And I know that some similar things are happening here at UT. We have a big good systems grand challenge about building ethics into technology. And so it's become a really hot topic, and that's really heartening for me to see.
Hey, excellent. So I'd like to start wrapping up, if I may, Sam. You've given us a lot of great stuff to think about, but we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful question that's related to the kinds of things that we've been talking about that an interested student might take a crack at?
Yeah, I would ask, what's next? So in terms of disinformation and propaganda online, if we've seen it spread like it has on Twitter and Facebook and other spaces, how is it going to spread in encrypted spaces? How are we going to study it in encrypted spaces like WhatsApp? What are the parameters there? What are the challenges? But also, we have to get real with ourselves about the fact that those kinds of messaging apps are becoming a lot more popular. In places like India and Brazil, they're already massively popular, but we know very little about what's happening there. That we do know that a lot of incubation of disinformation campaigns happens in those spaces. And so what does it look like when it transfers? Right now, I'm thinking big about encryption and how it's so beneficial and so important for people who are working to fight for democracy, but also it's also a mechanism for those that are doing all the other stuff.
I see. Could you expound just a little bit more on what you mean by encrypted spaces? Like, for example, if a researcher wanted to, you can purchase the Twitter fire hose, right? You can gain access to enough Twitter data to be able to do some research and analyze it. Are you talking about data sources that cannot be accessed in that way?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So what I'm talking about when I talk about this is like encrypted chat applications or end-to-end encrypted spaces or transport layer encrypted spaces. So messaging spaces. So WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, Viber, Discord is transport layer encrypted. All of these spaces that are crucial infrastructural communication technologies, but to which we do not have access to as much data. Telegram's a little different. We do have access to some data there, but secret chats on Telegram have been used for a lot of malicious purposes. I'm not suggesting that we need to undercut encryption or undercut these technologies. Far from it. I think these technologies are absolutely crucial for a variety of reasons to the success of free speech and democracy. What I am saying is we have to study them. We have to figure out how to study them, and it might mean working more qualitatively than quantitatively, and that's a particular challenge. Or working more with metadata if we are working quantitatively.
Do you think that there will be some incentive levers for these organizations that have transport layer and encryption to make data available for research purposes?
There's a lot of pressure from the research community on these organizations to do so. If they're able to keep the information completely anonymous, then perhaps, but a lot of these organizations have a particular set of ethos. They actually have some ethics that prevent them from doing exactly what we're talking about, because the people who use these platforms do so with the expectation of privacy, even if it's transport layer encrypted and the company has access to the data. So I have heard of all kinds of clever ways to work with metadata and to do some different things qualitatively. For instance, my team has a big project on propaganda over encrypted messaging apps right now. And we're just doing a ton of interviews to build a sense of the space. So talking to former propagandists, talking to former government actors around the world, talking to people who've been on the receiving end, and trying to build a picture of what we see happening there before we jump in and do the metadata stuff.
Interesting. All right. Wow. Okay. Last item, Sam. Could you recommend a book or other online resource that interested audience members might check out if they want a deeper dive into some of these topics?
Yeah, sure. So shameless self-promotion. I have two books. One that just came out is Bots, and it's all about everything to do with bots, and it's particularly apropos with the Twitter Elon Musk lawsuit going on right now. And then I have another book that's coming out in January that people can pre-order called Manufacturing Consensus. So it builds on Herman and Chomsky's ideas, but for the digital age. And I was lucky enough to get Chomsky to blurb the book, which was one of the greatest moments of my career. And that comes out in January and kind of builds on a lot of, that stuff. Digital resources, the Center for Media Engagement here at University of Texas has a ton of really great articles about dealing with some of the diciest informational issues that we have in our time. There's a number of other Knight Foundation funded centers across the United States, including one at University of Washington, one at University of North Carolina, that are also producing really fantastic information on these very problems. And I would highly recommend people seek those out.
Sam Wooley, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me, John. It's been great.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.